Hello, friends. Matt Petrusic here, Senior Director of the Word on Fire Institute, and we are back. Day 2 of Evangelization and Culture Live. Our current live seminar is with Mark Bradford, very good friend of the Institute, also our fellow for persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The seminar is called 3 Threats to Disabled and What We Can Do About It, and today we'll be looking at healthy sexual development for young adults with intellectual disabilities. I'm really glad that you got to meet Joshua, our assistant director, yesterday. You'll be seeing much more of him as we move on. And remember, this is interactive, so as I ask every time, please open up the chat. It's at the very bottom of the page. Open that chat icon up and introduce where you're watching from. And please feel free not only to put those questions and comments in there throughout, especially towards the end as we turn to conversation, but to converse with each other. I got to watch the live the first day 1 on just right after I landed, and it's fantastic. I want you to all remember that everything we do, live seminars and everything else, is recorded. So if you're only able to catch a piece of this, or if you weren't able to catch it yesterday, please remember you can see everything under previous live shows and seminars. So with that, we will turn back to Mark Bradford. Class is in session. Mark.
Okay, class is in session. Thanks, Matt. Welcome back, those of you who were with us yesterday. So great to have you with us again, and welcome if you weren't with us yesterday, if this is the first session that you're participating in here. Yesterday we talked about our first threat to the disabled, which is the new eugenics and our society's quest for perfection, and what this quest for perfection means when we're talking about people with disabilities. In an age where we have the technological capabilities to prenatally diagnose various genetic anomalies prior to birth, and unfortunately in our culture, there's a very real possibility that people will choose to terminate the life of that child, to end the life of that child through abortion after they get that diagnosis. So today we're going to move on to a different topic. Today we're going to talk about sexuality. It's a delicate topic, I know, and I would just want to put a warning out. If you're parents and you have young children with you, we may get into some things in this conversation this afternoon. It'll be a little delicate. It's a delicate topic to deal with, I know, but it's a very important one, and it's one that's really not discussed except by our secular society, which has a very distorted view of the human person from an anthropological perspective, which has very strong implications for the understanding of sexuality when people with disabilities are concerned. So just let that be a warning to you. We're going to show a video too that was used on World Down Syndrome Day a bit later in the presentation, and there are a couple of moments in that we were saying yesterday we probably would label it PG-13 if we needed to put a label on it. So just be aware, and if you have young children with you, you may want to consider finding someplace else for them to go at your discretion, obviously. Tomorrow we'll be wrapping up this 3-day seminar, and we'll be talking about mental health and disability. So those are the 3 topics that we're talking about yesterday. As I said, the new eugenics and our obsession with perfection. Today, sexual rights and healthy attitudes and relationships, people with disabilities, and then disability and mental health tomorrow, the church, and how the church can be a pathway and a vehicle for healing in this mental health crisis that we have nowadays. So as we get started on this topic, I remember just this morning, and I was thinking through this, a very dear friend of mine, John Haas, who is the president, he's come back as the president actually for a brief time of the National Catholic Bioethics Center. He's been a good friend for 30-some years, and we used to teach together at St. Charles Borromeo Seminary in Philadelphia. And he was telling me that when he was a moral theologian, and he was telling me that when he would talk about sexuality with the seminarians, he would light a candle in class, just because he wanted to separate that topic out from the others and give it the reverence that it was due, and help the men to understand that when you're talking about human sexuality, you're talking about something that is God's gift, certainly, but it's something that's held as sacred within the human person. It's that area of our humanness in which we most closely participate with the creative nature of God, I believe, because we, in our human capacity, have the capability, the biological capability of engendering new life with our spouse, and a new life into which God infuses a soul that's destined for eternity. So we're really talking about something that's vitally important, again, because of these distortions that have come into our culture around this topic of sexuality. There are many people still that have an attitude toward people with disabilities who have some sort of physical disfigurements or cognitive impairments or whatever it might be. They believe that they're asexual beings, that it's really not something that we need to talk about and we really need to deal with too much, because they traditionally don't marry. They've traditionally, in the past, at least that most people know of, not had sexual relationships. And there's just this attitude for people that reside outside of the disabled community. Those of us who live inside that community know this is completely false. But for people who live outside the community, many people have that perception, along with many other flawed perceptions of disability, that people with disabilities are asexual beings. So it's often a difficult topic for parents to address, certainly, has been, I know, in my family. There's very little support from the church in any sort of substantial way to help us know how to work through this topic. In fact, my wife and I went to see actually a priest who was a friend of ours when our son was beginning to come into puberty for some advice from him. And this is a man that has committed his life to working as a chaplain for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And we're asking him some questions, and he really didn't have answers for us himself. So again, this is a very important topic, one that we need to delve in with a great deal of thoughtfulness, a great deal of sensitivity, but finding ways that we can support families and our loved ones as they grow and mature with the disabilities that they live with each day. There are governing ideologies really on both sides of this question, as we can all imagine. We know that the secular world out there has such a distorted view of who we are, as I already said, and such a distorted view of sexuality. It's equated with recreation more than what its intended purpose is. And that's a very sad reality of the world that we live in. That's something that is so specially embedded within us, in this capability that we have to be treated in such a light and frivolous way. So we have that, and we have also ideologies, frankly, in the church's side, where there's sometimes a certain some prudishness or reticence to talk about issues, or again, some improper assumptions that are made about sexuality when we're talking about individuals with disability. So in the absence of the church's voice, and a reasoned voice that comes from a perspective of faith, there's all kinds of room for these contemporary ideologies to become the governing ideology in a culture, and that's certainly where we are now. So the church's assumptions in silence can be damaging to individuals. So Pope John Paul II, Saint John Paul II, and the many gifts that he gave us during his pontificate, and certainly his theology of the body is one, and we'll get into that a little bit, just a very small amount a little bit later. But he addressed an international symposium on the dignity and rights of the mentally disabled person in January of 2004, and he had really what I believe is the cornerstone comment about how we begin to address the topic of disability and sexuality. And I'll read, this is only a part of this statement, and this is where we're starting. So I'll read through it, and then we're going to take this apart in 3 different parts. But the whole statement is this: the care of the emotional and sexual dimensions of disabled persons deserves special attention. This aspect is often ignored, glossed over, and reduced, or even dealt with ideologically. Instead, the sexual dimension is a constitutive dimension of the human being as such, created in the image of the God of love and called from the outset to find fulfillment in the encounter with others and in communion. The premise for the emotional sexual education of disabled persons is inherent in the conviction that their need for love is at least as great as anyone else's. Such a rich and beautiful statement from a man that gave us so many rich and beautiful statements. But it really flies in the face of an attitude that these individuals are asexual beings that don't need our attention. John Paul II was saying exactly the opposite, right? That it's an area that we really do need to pay special attention to because of the delicacy of the topic, certainly as we talked about the dignity of the person themselves who are disabled, and their needs as they begin to grow and develop as human persons. So first off, we're going to take the first part of this, as you can see highlighted in a different color. So this aspect is often ignored. We've talked about that. It's often ignored and glossed over or reduced and even dealt with ideologically. So what we're going to talk about first of all is how that topic is dealt with ideologically and the way that our contemporary culture is addressing the topic of sexuality when it comes to people living with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So first of all, this comment, and this is just from a Disability Rights Center in New Hampshire, and we're going to take this in two different contexts. So in a world where we classify, sort, separate, and stigmatize, it is important to remember that people with all types of disabilities are sexual beings with the same diversity of sexual desires and interests as people without disabilities. The American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities puts it this way: people with intellectual disabilities and/or developmental disabilities, like all people, have inherent sexual rights. These rights and needs must be affirmed, defended, and respected. So I think we can take the first paragraph and say, okay, this is true. Individuals with disabilities have the same needs, same desires. They're sexual beings with the same diversity of sexual desires and interests as people without disabilities. True. We have all sorts of different attitudes towards sex and sexual relationships and many temptations even in Christians that live faithful and chaste lives. So all of those same sorts of things, they're saying, reside in individuals with disabilities as well. But the problem, I think, gets to be here. People with intellectual disabilities and/or developmental disabilities, like all people, have inherent sexual rights. That's a problematic statement, I think. Do we have inherent sexual rights? These rights, they say, are needs, and they must be affirmed, defended, and respected. Well, we'll get into this idea of rights in just a minute, but just let that reside in your mind for just a moment and think about what that means. We have inherent rights. Well, we have an inherent right to life, right? Do we have inherent sexual rights? Well, we'll talk about who we are as sexual beings in just a minute. And in a certain sense, I guess you can say, under the right circumstances, in the right moral context, we have some sort of sexual rights. But when you start to talk about rights and sexuality, that is something that comes out of loving relationships, we get into a really difficult area that we have to parse out a little bit more carefully. So we need to think about that. We need to acknowledge what the first paragraph says is right here, that these are sexual beings. They aren't asexual, as we already said, with a lot of diversities of desires. And we can imagine in the disabled community, with the diversity of abilities and the profundity of some disabilities, you can imagine there are a tremendous amount of varieties of sexual desires and interests there that need to be brought into a context of a chaste life, if we're speaking as Catholics, which we are. So this is a joint position statement from the American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disability and the ARC. The ARC is an advocacy organization for people with disabilities. It used to be called the Association for Retarded Citizens, and of course we don't use that word anymore. Now it's just called simply the ARC. And this is from 2013, a statement that they put together to defend the rights of persons with intellectual and developmental disabilities. So it says every person has the right to exercise choices regarding sexual expression and social relationships. The presence of intellectual and developmental disability, regardless of severity, does not in itself justify the loss of rights related to sexuality. So we're really nailing down here on this idea of rights. We have to be careful about what rights mean again, and we're getting to that in a little bit later, but let's go on. The statement continues and says, all people have the right within interpersonal relationships to develop friendships and emotional and sexual relationships where they can love and be loved and begin and end a relationship as they choose. They have a right to dignity and respect, and they have a right to privacy, confidentiality, and freedom of association. So I think in some of those things we can say, well, yeah, sure. But with everything, context is so essential. If we're understanding this in the context of a secular society out of which this was produced, we know what they're saying here. And these are the two major advocacy organizations for people who live with intellectual and development disabilities. The AAIDD, which is more of a professional, professional development organization, whereas the ARC is a much more of a on-the-street sort of advocacy organization for these individuals. So that if we go on, then with respect to sexuality, individuals have a right to sexual expression and education, reflective of their own cultural, religious, and moral values and of social responsibility, which means that they should respect our religious and moral values. Individualized education and information to encourage informed decision-making, including education about such issues as reproduction, marriage and family life, abstinence and safe sexual practices, sexual orientation, sexual abuse, and sexually transmitted diseases. And they have a right to protection from sexual harassment and from physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. A big hooray to that last bullet, and that's a huge problem in this community that we'll get into a little bit later too. The incidence of sexual harassment and sexual abuse and exploitation is huge in this community, and a very, very much a serious problem that needs to be addressed. And to give a little teaser about what's coming, we have to be very careful about how we approach the whole topic and what we present as a right and a privilege within this community of people because of the prevalence of abuse and what we might be exposing people to. So another organization, Disability Rights in California, and their principles of personal autonomy have this to say about what autonomy should mean in this regard for people with disabilities. They should be independent and make life decisions, including decisions others may believe are not in the person's best interest. They have a right to be in consensual sexual relationships in alignment with their sexual orientation. In other words, brings into the umbrella the whole LGBT thing. And then they have a right to express their gender identity, which puts a big emphasis on the T of the transgender ideology that's so prevalent now as well. So, what is this saying? We're taking people who, once again, we have to understand disabilities on a huge scale, from people who are very slightly or moderately impaired intellectually to people who are profoundly cognitively impaired. And we're saying that these people, in a blanket statement, they can make their own life decisions and decisions that others may believe are not in the person's best interest. Well, what does autonomy mean, and what are the boundaries, reasonable boundaries, that should be put on autonomy for individuals who may not be in a position to make the best choices for their life? And who is in the best position to help them make those choices in the best possible way? It depends on the individual, certainly, but in many cases it's the family and it's the parents or guardians that take the place of family members at some point, possibly, who are in the best position to understand, know the capabilities of the person, and know where the boundaries around autonomy should be placed. Yes, we need to provide the ability for individuals with disabilities to control their own lives to the extent that they're capable. God gave us dominion over the earth, right? I think I might have said this in my last seminar, but God gave us dominion over the earth at the very beginning, as we can read in the book of Genesis. And that I believe that has placed this desire for autonomy within each of us. We want to exercise that dominion, at least over our own lives, if we can't beyond, and where we get into some issues with individuals who are impaired cognitively and need some guidance and some protection, frankly, we get some pushback often, and we need support. We don't need voices out there saying that, ignore those voices that are holding you back and express yourself as whatever way you would like. So there needs to be prudence. The virtue of prudence needs to really be the governing virtue here in helping families to discern what the right thing to do is. So continuing on with disability rights, California, people have the right to engage in consensual sex and sexual activities that do not infringe upon other people's rights, and to private places to express their sexuality. To assistive technologies, medical care or equipment to express their sexuality, and a right to identify as a gender other than the one assigned at birth, and then it goes on from there. So here we go again. It's just all of the what you would expect, a very secularized, a-religious culture to be producing and encouraging for individuals with disabilities. And so there are some very provocative ways in which certain people are trying to encourage to be made available to people to help them express themselves sexually in the ways that these statements are referring to. So there's this whole area around what's called sexual assistance or sexual services now as well. And this is taken from an article that's called Sexual Assistance for People with Intellectual Disability, Proposal for a Service Delivery Model. And this is from February 2022. It's an open access publication. You can go online and read it if you'd like. But it defines sexual assistance as a service that provides support for people with disabilities to access and engage in sexual activities, including preparation using sex aids, physical assistance with bodily movement and positioning. Advocates believe this practice allows individuals with disabilities to exercise their sexual rights on an equal basis as non-disabled individuals. And then you can imagine, your imagination can, I'm sure, fill in what intimacy coaching might mean in practice, what medically assisted sex might mean in practice, and certainly sexual education and support is self-explanatory. But wherever your imagination takes you with those, yes, it's essentially legalized prostitution to assist people who have intellectual or developmental disabilities to find their sexual expression. Sorry. So the authors then further specify a sexual assistant as any person who provides sexual assistance to physically and or intellectually disabled people, and then they get very specific on what that sexual assistance is, but I'm not going to. You can imagine what it is. So that's where the culture is going in terms of what it's trying to provide for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. And that's sort of at the leading edge, I would say. I don't know how available those services are. I've read about them many times before, and they certainly exist. So anyway, use your imagination, but stop. Don't use your imagination too far. We don't want anyone going to confession here. So unless you have to, then go. So anyway, this is a video. Every year, World Down Syndrome Day is on March 21st every year. And there's an advocacy organization in Italy called Core Down, and they do this big production of a video that's put out to promote inclusion and acceptance of people with intellectual disability. Well, in this case, Down syndrome, because it's World Down Syndrome Day, March 21st. So I just want to play this video for you, and then we're going to talk about this a little bit. But this is what a major advocacy organization is producing. And there are other organizations that help fund these. So Core Down manages the production of the videos. But like Down Syndrome International, the National Down Syndrome Society, these various other organizations that are either international or nationally based organizations have helped fund and provide for. When I was with the Jerome Lejeune Foundation many years ago, we helped fund one of these. It was really a beautiful one and nothing like this one. So anyway, we'll run this for you and you can just watch it. It's like maybe 7 minutes and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so why don't we go ahead and play that.
Hey bartender, you assume that I cannot drink a margarita, so you don't serve me a margarita? So I don't drink a margarita. Your assumption becomes reality. And parents, you assume that I cannot live on my own, so you don't encourage me to live on my own. So I don't live on my own. Coach, you assume that I cannot hit harder, so you don't train me to hit harder. So I don't hit harder. And teacher, you assume that I cannot learn Shakespeare. So, you don't teach me Shakespeare.
Old MacDonald had a farm.
So I don't learn Shakespeare. E-I-E-I-O. But hey, if all your assumptions become reality, then assume that I can drink a margarita. Will you serve me a margarita? So I drink a margarita. Assume that I can live on my own. So I live on my own. Assume that I can hit harder. So I hit harder. Assume that I can learn Shakespeare. So, what fools these mortals be! I learned fucking Shakespeare. You assume I can swear, right? Assume that I can do that job. That I can go to parties. That I can have sex. That I can be on stage. Assume that I can. So maybe I will.
All right, so there you have it. This is, again, video that was produced for World Down Syndrome Day this year in 2024. And you can see what it's promoting. It's promoting for individuals with Down syndrome, in this case, broaden it out to intellectual developmental disabilities. It's promoting a lifestyle. It's centered around bar life, nightlife, autonomy to be able to do what they want. But the presentation by this actress, I think her name is Madison something, is crass, and it's unpleasant, to say the least. And it's encouraging even to the point of the ability to engage in sex as you choose. And it's a very unfortunate image to provide to young women, especially with Down syndrome, who are so charmed by anything that's on a screen. My son is the same. Many people with Down syndrome are enchanted by the whole world of movies and actors and actresses. And to see something like this and to promote this kind of lifestyle to young people that is encouraging them to live in a reckless way and to engage in activities that might lead once again to their exploitation and their sexual grooming for abuse is criminal in my mind. It's just absolutely criminal. I know some of the people who are involved with this. And I wrote to everyone who I saw that had produced it originally. To just say, one of them was people at the National Down Syndrome Society, and this is a response to my email. She said, "Thank you so much for reaching out to NDSS," that's the National Down Syndrome Society, "and for sharing your perspective. Feedback from the community is extremely important to us." Of course, they all say that. "We absolutely respect that some aspects of the video with Madison won't resonate with everyone in our community. Everyone has unique belief systems, and we appreciate that. This video was meant to start conversations around individuals with Down syndrome's autonomy and how they have historically been limited or infantilized by society. We've been collecting info, and we'll make sure that Core Down receives your feedback." So yeah, certainly it's important to respect people's autonomy to the extent that we can, as they already said. So my response back to her was, "Michelle, thank you for responding. Everyone's belief system should recognize how impressionable individuals with Down syndrome are, and given the prevalence of grooming and sexual assault in the community, concerned about presenting images of a lifestyle that is potentially dangerous to these young women. The natural boundary for autonomy is providing reasonable protection. Madison may project an image wise to these dangers and have the ability to protect herself, but as we know, that is certainly not true across the spectrum of ability." I never heard back after this one. I didn't really expect to, but it's this idea that we have to accept this just openness and this sort of an unbridled and unbridled to the point of unhinged assumption that individuals can manage their affairs. Some may, but we're talking about a wide range of abilities, and this isn't marked out just for individuals at the top band that may be able to go out and live in a bar lifestyle and not be taken advantage of by people who are not looking out for their best interest. So just to quote once again from a publication of the ARC, who we read from the joint statement of the AIDD and the ARC before, "Studies consistently demonstrate that people with intellectual disabilities are sexually victimized more often than others who do not have a disability. For example, one study reported that 25% of girls and women with intellectual disabilities who were referred for birth control had a history of sexual violence. Other studies suggest that 49% of people with intellectual disabilities will experience 10 or more sexually abusive incidents. And this is just one recounting of statistics. You can go online and you can find others, and the incidence of sexual exploitation and abuse is frighteningly huge. There are bad actors out there who will take advantage of people who are vulnerable for their own selfish ends. And again, in my mind, to promote something like this in such a reckless way, as I said in my response to this woman at the NDSS, is completely irresponsible, and even cruel. So anyway, what does the church say about all this? Well, it doesn't say much, I'm afraid. The church has profound teachings on sexuality, we know. We have a whole understanding, and largely thanks to Pope St. John Paul II, an expanded understanding of who we are as sexual persons, as human beings. We certainly have an understanding of marriage and the responsibilities of marriage, and those have been articulated in canon law. They've even been articulated for persons with disabilities in a document about persons with disabilities and the sacraments that was put out by the USCCB, the United States Conference of Catholic Bishops. But that's about where it ends, really. And so there are a lot of questions that parents are left with that they really don't have much access to responses to. Thankfully, there are two women who teach at Notre Dame, both who, one of them I know at least has a child with intellectual disability. The other I'm not so sure, but Mary O'Callaghan is one, and Claire Kilbane is the other. And they've put this course together at Notre Dame called The Body and Beyond, Human Sexuality for Young People with Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities from a Catholic Perspective. And this is the greatest resource we have. If you go to the McGrath Center at Notre Dame, you can look it up and you can find it. The course is online, and I think you can just join it and do it at any time, I think. This was done also, I think, at one point with the NCPD, National Catholic Partnership for Disability. I had to think a minute for what that meant. So Mary O'Callaghan has written a chapter in a book that we're in the process of publishing now through Word on Fire that I'm editing, that is it's a compilation of a series of essays by various individuals who work within the disability area, anything from prenatal diagnosis to inclusive Catholic education to dealing with perinatal loss, a whole range of topics. Anyway, Mary has written a chapter on disability and sexuality, so I think we'll have that out next fall maybe, or probably about a year from now. It's in production now, and hopefully it will be a valuable asset and get Mary some more exposure, and also the program at Notre Dame some more exposure for families especially who are confronted with so many difficult questions around their children and their healthy sexual development. So, okay, let's move on to the next part of Pope St. John Paul II statement from his address at this International Symposium on the Dignity and Rights of the Mentally Disabled Person from January 2004. And that next statement is this: the sexual dimension is a constitutive dimension of the human being as such, created in the image of God of love, and called from the outset to find fulfillment in the encounter with others and in communion. Pretty rich statement there. There's a lot to unpack. So the sexual dimension is a constitutive, I always have trouble saying that word, constitutive dimension of the human being as such. They're human persons, part of all of us, disabled or not. We're created in the image of the God of love, and called from the outset to find fulfillment in the encounter with others and in communion. So Pope St. John Paul II has moved us away from the language of rights here, right? He's moved us into the language of love. He's talking about our need for communion, our need for the encounter with others. encountering others in communion are not the language of rights. You know, we talk about conjugal rights in theological language in the church, but, you know, in a marriage, conjugal rights are not things that you can demand. They're things that you share in the openness one with the other in the proper context. So as we take this apart a little bit, we have to really sort of focus on that idea of communion. Not happening in the context of rights, but happening within the context of charity, within the context of love. So this word constitutive has really two meanings to it that we can use. It's something that forms a part of something, but it's also something that is like an organizing principle of the existence of something. And what we're talking about here is that latter definition. We're talking about something that is really the organizing principle of who we are made to be as human persons, made for communion in the image of the Trinity. So John Paul II's teaching again was so rich. You know, he has this wonderful, he gave these series of Wednesday audiences for, how long did it go, 2 years or 2.5 years or something like that, where his theology of the body really started in the book Love and Responsibility that he published before he became Pope. But then all of these Wednesday audiences were combined in this wonderful book called Male and Female. He created them, I think is what it was called. And he talked in the theology of the body, in presenting his theology of the body, about this original solitude, going back to the very beginning of the book of Genesis, how man was created in this original solitude, alone. And he saw all of the animals go past him, and he named them all and was given dominion over all of these things, but he was alone. He had no one like himself. And in seeing everything that God had created, he knew that he was unique in the midst of all that creation. It wasn't just another animal out there that had processed by him that he'd named, you know, cow and duck and chicken and lion and whatever he named them back in those days. It's also interesting then that God decided he needed some company, right? And God said he created man, male and female, he created them. So we have this man being created originally, from which two beings emerged that are identified by their sex as male and female, who together constitute a unity of person within the sacrament of matrimony. So there is this natural attraction for us, right? All of us who are married have experienced this attraction. All of us who are married in the church and live with our spouses, we're past 35 years, my wife and I at this point, many of you maybe more, we live in this communion. And as I said yesterday, it's a school of love, right? Marriage is a school of love. It's how we learn to live together in this union that God originally envisioned humanity to be. Not always easy, but it's what God envisioned humanity to be. So we can be a mirror of his love for us. So this original solitude of man then, with the creation of Eve, that Adam recognizes as bone of my bone and flesh of my flesh. The satisfaction of his desire for communion. The satisfaction that he had for someone like himself. And his original solitude becomes then what John Paul II called an original unity. So that's the natural tendency for all of us, right? That's what has kept the human race perking along for millennia, is this natural desire that we have for communion and the very special desire that we have to come together as male and female in the sacrament of marriage to form one flesh. And in the unity of that one flesh, the two coming together and being one, we generate new life. And that's just nature. It's nature in the animal world on a certain level, right? But it's a different kind of nature, obviously, when we're talking about us as human persons. So God knew that it was not good that man should be alone. But then what are we looking at when we're looking at people with disabilities who who may be looking at lives alone? It's a tough question to address, but it's one that we have to dig into to try to understand some way or another what we can do to help individuals who have intellectual development disabilities, very little prospects for finding that original unity that Adam and Eve found, to find a way to satisfy the desire for communion. So we have to talk about that a bit. There's a little bit of a sidetrack that we need to take here, I think, when we're talking about bringing back in, again, society's influences to this. And so I think it's a good place to mention the issues of homosexuality and gender dysphoria. Because we know that within the autism community, this phenomena of gender dysphoria is much more prevalent than it is in the typical population. And it's a question that no one has a good answer for right now. We can't even get an accurate statistic on what that incidence might be of the coexisting conditions of both autism and gender dysphoria, but we know that it's more prevalent, and some percentages are pretty high. Some percentages say 14.5%, or some studies say 14.5%. Individuals with gender dysphoria are also autistic. Some say 7.8% of children. The statistics are all over the place, but we know that it exists. It's something to make note of here as we're talking about this. It's a phenomenon, again, that no one understands. And when we get into this whole area of research around issues that affect the LGBTQ plus so-called community, we know that we also get into a lot of biased research. So it's really very impossible to come to an adequate explanation of the phenomenon and an adequate or an accurate estimation of the incidence of the situation. But just know that it does exist. Also, within this community, somewhere between 30 and 36% of disabled people specify as being someplace on the LGBTQ spectrum, but that's self-reporting. And there are many problems with self-reporting, especially nowadays. So it's difficult to know where this stands, but it's also important to understand that it does exist. And for parents in this culture, we just had a prayer request come into Word on Fire this past week from a mother who's distraught because her child is starting to identify with this, it's a transgender ideology. It happens in very good families, places where you would not expect it. And it certainly is happening at a higher incidence in the disabled community. So it's something for families to be aware of and to watch out for, and then to find good help for if necessary and when possible. Unfortunately, there are organizations out there, once again, we read through some of the guidelines and the rights being expressed by the major advocacy organizations in this country. And they're certainly advocating for people to be able to express themselves however they should choose. But we know that's not God's will for anyone. And so we have to understand that when that does appear in our families, we need to be aware of it, not try to bury it, but find help and try to help our children and our loved ones work through it. The disability rights movement has become very aligned with the whole sort of postmodern Marxist movement that's out there that centers around this academic area called grievance studies, that is finding grievances everywhere. And in the grievances, they're finding what they're calling intersectionality. So they're looking for people who have suffered as much as they have suffered. And these intersectional relationships, so someone might be, they might be disabled, and they might have gender dysphoria, or they might believe that they have homosexual tendencies or whatever. And that aligns with people of color, and that aligns with people of whole spectrum of different areas within the disability rights area that fall into this area of grievance studies. So they're looking for partners. They're drawing in all these people under the same sort of banner and category and using them to exercise what they hope will be power to transform culture, just like the rest of these cultural Marxists are doing. So that's something to be aware of also, and just realize that there are forces out there who are trying to promote these things in very unhealthy ways. So anyway, let's go on as we move toward the end in a Q&A section. I hope you're getting your questions in there so we can work on those when we finish here in just a couple of minutes. But we're moving on now to the last section of Pope St. John Paul II's statement. And he says, the premise for the emotional sexual education of disabled persons is inherent in the conviction that their need for love is at least as great as anyone else's. And we've really been emphasizing that, and you should be understanding that by now, and I'm sure you probably do already, but their need for love is at least as great as anyone else's. Their desire for that communion, the relationship, is as great as anyone else's. So under that premise, we need to work on understanding how we can approach that from their emotional and sexual education to help them navigate the natural desires that are there within them. So how we do that? Difficult. The way most of us do is we find someone that we love and we pledge our life to them in marriage, right? So can people with developmental disabilities marry? Intellectual disabilities, rather, are included under this larger banner. The canon law says all persons who are not prohibited by law can contract marriage. So what might those prohibitions be that would keep someone from being able to marry? Well, we know that if someone believes that if a couple is having trouble and who is married and they separate and they're Catholic, they might go to seek out an annulment. And what that process of annulment does is it looks for a reason that there may not have been consent given, or there might not have been the capacity to assent to a marriage bond in the first place, which means that the marriage never happened. So what would defects of consent be, and how might they apply to individuals? As a wise pastor is counseling a couple with an intellectual disability who comes and says that they want to be married, what would they look for? So do they have sufficient use of reason? So canon law states that any permanent or temporary lack of the use of reason due to severe disability, mental illness, psychological disturbance, or intoxication at the time of the celebration of marriage prevents a person from making an act of consent. Okay, so there's one. Lack of sufficient use of reason. Next, grave lack of grave lack of discretion of judgment. So because of a psychological defect, or either temporary or permanent, the person could not make sound judgment at the time of the wedding. Person's inability to discern marriage can be for one of three reasons. Person was incapable of comprehending the basic meaning of marriage. The person was incapable of assessing whether the other person or the marriage would be suitable, or the person was inwardly opposed to the marriage but could not freely choose otherwise. So there was no freedom of consent in the sacrament. So I think, and we'll get to the others of these, but I think we're looking here, we can really, even as parents who have children with disabilities that fall in love and want to get married. Big crushes happen my son has had some, in this world. And there are people now getting married with Down syndrome or other disabilities as well. But these, in the Catholic context, are two of the items that would be a defect of consent. If someone doesn't have sufficient use of their reason, or if there's a grave discretion of judgment. Moving on, an inability to assume the essential obligations of marriage. So at the time of the celebration of marriage, one of the parties was altogether incapable of taking the essential obligations of marriage. In other words, permanence, fidelity, openness to children for reasons of a psychological nature. And there could also be reasons of just the inability to understand what that means. Inability to provide for a family, right? The lack of supports that might be able to help that couple make it as a married couple. And then lastly, ignorance. The person simply did not know the following about marriage, that it is a permanent partnership between a man and a woman that is ordered toward the procreation of offspring and by means of some sexual cooperation. So these are all areas that might prohibit someone from with an intellectual disability from marrying. I've said this before here in another seminar. I'm personally very conservative in this area, other areas too. But in this one, we have to be very careful. We're talking about people's lives, and we're talking about permanence when we're talking about marriage. And there is so much cuteness involved in a couple. You have a child with a disability and they fall in love with someone, and you have a crush. There's a sentimentality about it that's easy to get swept into. Just put it that way. And you have to really be careful when you're dealing with a situation like that to know how to address it wisely and try to navigate the situation off in other ways, as John Paul II alluded to in what he said. So this is a continuation of the statement of John Paul II that we've been reading from and taking apart during this seminar. It says, the experience of certain Christian communities has shown that an intense and stimulating community life, continuous and discrete educational support, the fostering of friendly contacts with properly trained people, the habit of channeling instincts and developing a healthy sense of modesty as respect for their own personal privacy often succeeds in restoring the emotional balance of persons with mental disabilities and can lead them to live enriching, fruitful, and satisfying interpersonal relationships. So all that is community, right? It's a strong community around the person and the family, but there should also be a strong community around the person in the parish, where there should be outlets for their desire for community, where they can be with others. And this point, we didn't go through the objectives, and I should have done this, I'm sorry. We're not going to take the time to do that now because we don't have time for questions. But if you go to the McGrath Center and you look up Claire and Mary's course, you'll see the objectives there. And one of those is a healthy sexual education for individuals' children who have intellectual disabilities. It's important for them to understand their bodies. It's important to understand what these desires are, but it's also important to help them understand how they need to be challenged, or channeled rather, not challenged, but channeled in a healthy and morally acceptable way, where we have to protect people from a culture that is trying to see them destroyed along with everyone else in the culture who has the ability to make the right decisions, but is always choosing to make the wrong ones. So there are challenges with children with disabilities, and there are some that are great for some families. There's inappropriate sexual behaviors that happen with some individuals with disabilities, especially around the time of sexual blossoming, puberty into adolescence. And some of those can be very difficult to deal with. And public acts and even as lightly as flirting, but it can be much more serious than that in some cases. There's also instances of some individuals who are it's very tragic, but there's sexual self-harm that they can become involved in, and sexual aggressions that might materialize. And we talked yesterday's seminar about the sterilization law in Virginia in 1924 that Carrie Buck was a victim of, and that sterilization law was put into place to try to curb the libido of some individuals who were sexually aggressive. And that still happens legally, but it does still happen. There are chemical castrations that can happen with males who are sexually aggressive if the court order demands it. And the morality of that, I don't think is there, but anyway, it's possible. So it's also for parents to understand, just like when we were talking about defects of consent in marriage, and we know from our own experiences and from people that we know around us that there can be a lack of culpability for sin. So, masturbation is obviously a big issue for boys, and parents have to do what they can do to try to help them move away from that tendency, because we know it's an intrinsically evil act. We can't do that sort of thing. But we have to also, as parents, seek wise counsel and understand that the culpability one may have for that sinful act may not be a condemning act because of their lack of ability to manage the situation. It's important to encourage healthy socialization. It's important for individuals with disabilities, and I've said this too many times probably during this last hour, but it's important to have individuals with disabilities within a healthy community where they can have healthy socialization and develop healthy friendships with good Catholic people who can help them grow and help mold them and steer them in the right direction as they may start to go off in the wrong direction from time to time. Important to teach children about their bodies, as we've already said. It's important to protect individuals from the potential for abuse and exploitation. Parents need to be wise to this because it's a real thing. And again, just so important to have support from family and community. So we have 20 minutes or so left for questions. That took longer than I thought it would. I've never spoken on this topic before, so I appreciate the opportunity to do it, and I hope you might have found it some way helpful.
Well, Mark, let me just start by saying, expressing how helpful people have found it, the courage that it takes for you to speak to this issue directly, and especially on such a topic that requires such delicacy, but also requires forthrightness and clarity. So on behalf of everyone, thank you very much for that. So let's start. We have some questions that are sort of more abstract level, and then we have some questions asking for some practical advice. So let me start at that more abstract level. You began today's presentation by noting how it's a very common perception from those outside the disability community to perceive those with disabilities as asexual. So we have a question of what do you think motivates that perception? Is it designed? Is it motivated by a desire to protect those with disabilities, or to protect ourselves from having to deal with the question itself?
That's a really good question. I think and I don't really know I can take a guess at it, and I think it could be some of both. I think we typically don't see people with disabilities in relationships. So if we don't see them in relationships and we think disability, some people even kind of deny the full humanity of individuals with disabilities, kind of put them in a different category of being. And some of the models of disability that we've talked about before and I've written about in some of my columns even get into this area, but where there are misperceptions that are just born out of a lack of understanding and a lack of exposure and presumptions. And yes, I think it's easy to say, no, they're not sexual beings. We don't need to deal with that.
Yeah. There's an understandable, again, the word I guess would be delicacy in not only this topic, but specifics with regards to sexuality, but also speaking about those with disabilities in general. Do you find that delicacy, that hesitation to make sort of any statements whatsoever, or to use highly guarded language in both sort of the broad level and specifically in your experience, do you find that helpful in actually serving the needs of those with disabilities? Really being guarded in how one speaks about it?
I think the level of guard that we need to raise when we're speaking about these topics is correlated to the community we're speaking with. I gave a disclaimer at the beginning, encouraged you if you have children. I think some of the things we talked about here, you probably don't want your children having to hear or listen to, but it was important to bring them out in this context, I think. So I think that would be my response to that. I think we have to be as frank as we have to be within the context that we're working within or speaking within. And we can't be afraid to talk about it. That's the problem of the past. And that's the point that I've tried to make here, is that we have to, as Catholics, we have to begin to address the issue within our communities, because we're up against a world out there that's bearing down on these people and trying to encourage all these things that I pointed out in the first part of this talk. So we have to address that as frankly as we have to within the context of the situations that we're in.
Also connected to this idea of perception and the way in which we speak about this issue, a question came up with regards to the issue of consent.
Yeah.
We're going to talk more in just a moment more about autonomy and whether that's a helpful category. But with regards to consent, the question is many sort of outside the disability community say, well, look, sexuality necessarily involves consent. Those with disabilities cannot give consent. Therefore, it's wrong to speak about sexuality as it applies to the kind of a syllogism there. Is that an accurate perception? It sounds like not from the way that you've given the presentation today, that there can be consent in certain cases.
There can be consent. Consent is a difficult issue, and it's a difficult topic when there are instances of sexual abuse, because if someone is arrested for raping a young woman with intellectual disabilities, let's say it's Down syndrome, that person might have been grooming that young woman and telling her that he loved her and that he's her boyfriend and he'll love her forever. Guys will say anything to get what they want. Some creeps, frankly. Probably isn't the right kind of word to use in such a proper environment, but they're creeps. And so a young woman might say, sure, I love you, I will do those things with you. And then the person's defense attorney, if they're a good defense attorney, will say the consent was given. Well, then how is consent determined?
Right.
And that's an issue that there was a conference in Rome this past summer, and I was involved in the preparatory meetings for it. I didn't go to that conference in Rome, but there were a series of meetings that we had here with a group of people from the disability world across the country who were helping to develop questions and topics that would be addressed in this conference on safeguarding individuals with disabilities in this very area. And I raised this issue of consent. And apparently there are some people who are sort of trying to strike at it in the legal world, because it is such an important, it's such an important topic. It's an important topic in healthcare, hugely important topic in healthcare. And it's also a hugely important topic in the law when we get around this area of sexual abuse.
Right. And consent can be difficult to identify even among persons who don't have disabilities. So again, connected to this, the idea of perception, some of our viewers were aware of or had seen a show on Netflix called Down for Love. I think you're already messaging your response here. Are you aware of the show, and does it get anything right about how to properly portray sexuality among those with, I think it's specifically those with Down syndrome in the show?
Yeah, you can go to Alatea and search under my name, and you'll see an article I wrote on that there. No, I think exploiting relationships, we've been pointing out what a difficult and challenging issue relationships are in this community. And you're going to take that and you're going to put it out on the screen. I mean, what kind of exploitation is that? You can't do that to people. You just can't. And the families around, everything, it's just awful. And reality shows, as we know, they're all staged. They're not reality, and they're just looking for clicks, and they're baiting audiences to get great numbers in so they can get great sponsorships and make another disgustingly horrible show. Sorry, but that's, you asked for my opinion.
Clarify,
there
please.
You have it.
A little more specificity there. So we'll take it back up to the theoretical level here, but it's a foundational question. Is your presentation did an excellent job, among many things, of really complexifying the use of rights language. And so the question that emerges within that context is has rights language reached a point in our contemporary culture, moral culture, political culture, that it's sort of become so contaminated that we should move away from it as a church? You offered so many qualifications that in this case, with these preconditions and this result and these cares, then we can speak about rights. Is it time for us to abandon that language and move to a different paradigm for speaking about how we should deal with this issue and the protection of life more generally?
Yeah, I have a vague memory stirring of you doing a Word on Fire show with Bishop Barron, where you might have talked about.
It's an ongoing question.
Yeah, I think the whole topic of rights is distorted now, right? And this is, as I recall your conversation with Bishop Barron, we think the state has assumed the role of God in dispersing rights to individuals, and we're happy to just let them do it. Mm-hmm. But it's not the state that gives rights. God gives rights. The state protects those rights. And if the state is not protecting the God-given rights, then yes, we need to move away from that and find another way to discuss the issue, because the vocabulary that's being used is set within a context now that we can't agree with. So I don't know what the language might be, but yeah, I don't think we can. We have to use language that makes sense to people. And when people hear the word right, I think very few people in our culture probably now believe that rights come from God at all. We've done away with the Declaration of Independence, and we've done away with the whole understanding of God's role in the management and government of human affairs, and the role of government in protecting it. So, yeah.
Well,
Maybe so.
connected to that, to the rights question, there seems to be also an important distinction. We're looking at rights conceived of as negative, so I have a right from, so certain forms of interference in my life would not be acceptable because I have a right. But you're bringing up also rights to within the disability community, or at least those who say they're advocating for them, that it's not only that you have a right not for people to interfere in your life, but you actually have a right to receive these kinds of services. Does that complexify things even further?
It does. And, I use the example of what we call conjugal rights in our tradition. And no one in the Catholic tradition would say that conjugal rights are something that we can demand.
Right.
In fact, it'd be the opposite, right? As soon as you're demanding your conjugal rights, you've lost them because you're not showing the appropriate love for your spouse that is due to your spouse. You're violating the most fundamental nature of the bond between you because you're violating the principle of charity that supersedes everything else.
How about the word autonomy? This is also a key word in your presentation here. Is it also a troublesome word that we might need to move away from?
Well, what would we substitute it with? I'm not sure. I think
Maybe responsibility, maybe even freedom.
maybe freedom. All freedoms have to be bridled in some sort of way. So maybe that is a good word. Because we know to be free isn't to be a libertine with absolutely no boundaries put around your freedoms. So maybe that is a good place to put it. Yeah. Yeah, but autonomy is the word that's used in this environment, and that's a big question for families that have children with disabilities, just how much autonomy you can grant. And, I really, yeah, we could do another seminar on that topic.
Oftentimes with the language of autonomy, it's taken to be sort of binary. Either one has autonomy and that's total, complete, or one does not have autonomy. But that doesn't seem to fit the experience of those with disabilities, right?
No, I think it has to be restricted for their safety, and that's where I said it needs boundaries around it. So maybe freedom is the better word because we're more used to, in the world that we live in anyway, we're more used to the idea of what freedom really is if we properly understand it. But if you go outside of our world, that's misunderstood too. So,
you also had some questions on the very important but also provocative video that you showed. The comments sort of coalesced around this sort of basic sense that in that video there's such positive messages, like, let me study Shakespeare. It's like, hurrah, right? Yes, of course study Shakespeare, and to use the word autonomy, there's certain things that those with disabilities we should see them as perhaps being able to live by themselves. And then it's mixed with this sort of sexual libertinism. So the question is this, coming from our viewers, is how do we approach this both as evangelists and those who want to advocate for those with disabilities when we encounter something so mixed that has such positive elements to it but also such poisonous elements to it? Is it something that we try and take the good and condemn the bad, or do we just sort of throw the whole thing out and say, no, this is not the way?
I would have thrown this video out and said this is not the way because I just think it's that damaging. I encouraged everyone, we have our communities in Word on Fire, you all know that, and I encouraged the people in the intellectual and developmental disabilities community to write to the people. I think I might have even provided the addresses or email addresses so you could, just because they need to hear that that's just not acceptable. That was so reckless. In my opinion, it was just so reckless.
Yeah.
It was crass and obnoxious, but just on a more level, the level of safeguarding individuals where they need safeguarding. It was reckless.
Connected to this question, but also broadening out to the effect of social media, especially YouTube. Some questions asking you both your experience as a professional, but also as a father. Is it been a positive or negative or probably mixed consequence of those with disabilities having access to formats like YouTube, where they can see all different kinds of videos, or we could just speak of being online in general? Is this on balance a good thing or a bad thing, or how should it be managed?
I think it's a bad thing for all of us, frankly.
Yeah, well, especially on the question of access to sexually charged materials.
I blocked YouTube at our router at our house.
Well, that answers that question.
So those with cellular connections can access it, but anyone trying to reach it on a desktop computer or anything in our home, you can't do it. And our younger son is 17. Our son with Down syndrome is 23, has no access to YouTube as much as he would love it. We have our television blocked so that you can't get anything above PG on our television without putting the code in, and he doesn't know the code. So yes, you don't want to fill a young person's or a developing person's mind that's already challenged making sense of the world with images that are damaging and destructive to them. So I think you have to do whatever you can do and have to do, and it's so hard. I mean, our 17-year-old is just too smart for me, and I just, he's always finding a way around everything I put on our computers and his phone. Not that he's looking for bad stuff, but he's really into music, and he'll, sort of learns guitar stuff, off of, videos.
This, you've probably already answered this question, but we had a specific question about whether it's ever morally accessible, if not ideal, but morally permissible, I should say, if not ideal, to allow those with disabilities access to pornography to help stymie or to help channel their sexual needs.
Channel their sexual needs. I think pornography stimulates their sexual needs that you're trying to not suppress, but you're trying to direct in a healthy way. And pornography is not going to direct anyone's sexual development in a healthy way. Mm-hmm. We're killing them if we allow it. It's just horrible. And that's where, that's what fuels so much of this sexual aggression in some individuals who don't necessarily have good executive function. And they, so it stimulates them to the point where they have to release it in some sort of way, and they'll find a way to release it. And that's where things go to court and people can press for a chemical castration of a young man who's too sexually aggressive.
So categorically, it only makes things worse.
No, yeah.
We have a question from, it looks like a family here, asking for advice on how to speak about puberty with your children who have disabilities.
Yeah. You always wish you knew what you knew when you were older, when you were younger, and you don't. And I think, we're embodied individuals, and our bodies are God's gift, and the way that our bodies function are God's gift, and our bodies are good. And I think that's what everyone has to understand, whether they're disabled or not. But I think we need to use the right names for things, or names that people will understand. And, in a family, families tend to have their names for parts that remain covered for the most part. Some of them are pretty funny, but but we have to use language that everyone. Sorry, we're laughing here in the studio.
Let the imagination go again. You authorize us to use our imagination, so we're all doing it.
Yeah. So I think understanding our bodies, understanding the way that they function, understanding that they have certain purposes that need to only be exposed to certain people under certain circumstances, and only used in certain kinds of ways, I think is important to try to, as you know as a parent, parents know when your child are reaching these levels of development. So you just need to try to help guide them through it in responsible and productive and healthy and positive ways.
And this is closely connected to that question about speaking about puberty. And as a final question, how do you speak about the virtue of chastity in a positive way, both with those who are prepubescent and also postpubescent?
Well, if anyone has the answer to that question, would you please send it to me?
Put it in the chat.
DM me in our communities or do something. It's just such a difficult topic. It's a difficult topic with typical kids growing up in a culture that tries to promote a lack of chastity in every possible way it can. In the entertainment and the music they listen to and the television programs, if they watch television, movies, we're living in a culture that is promoting everything that we talked about in the first part of this for everyone. And we just have to, once again, go back to the goodness of the body. But the body is good and reserved in its tremendous capacity for the generation of life under the circumstances that are the best circumstances for new life to come into the world, and that's within a family. And when you're playing around with sexual activity outside of that relationship, you're risking damaging your life, the life of someone else, and the other life that you might bring into the world.
Right.
And you don't really want to do that, do you? You have to keep your body chaste, save it for the right moment and the right person when you come together in that beautiful unity. John Paul II is just, I was going by working with my son on some things, was going back and reading in the Theology of the Body a while back, and it is just so beautiful.
It is good.
Yeah, it's so beautiful.
So sane and healthy. Yeah.
It is. And I was involved with this network of Catholic classical schools in the Philadelphia area before I came to Word on Fire. And one of our schools has a whole program of theology of the body for kids in the school, because there's a theology of the body for children that's been put together, which helps them understand a real healthy, natural development of childhood. And I think if you can encourage that, if you have your children in a Catholic school and encourage that, I think it's a really good thing to do.
Mark Bradford, thank you. To be continued, and thank you all for tuning in. Remember, this is all recorded and will be up on the platform again soon. I saw some of you had to come in later, not a problem. And please join us again tomorrow for day 3. We'll see you then.